within the trucking industry of drivers is becoming all too common these days. In this video, we'll talk about who's doing the bullying, why this is happening, how are they doing the bullying, and how to solve this problem. This video is brought to you by GP Transco, a great mid-sized carrier out of Illinois. They do things a little bit differently, and they pay their drivers really well. If you're an experienced driver and you want to be treated with respect, check out GP Transco at their website at gptransco.com. First off, let's talk about who primarily is doing the bullying. Drivers are being bullied by lower management staff, primarily dispatchers and occasionally salesmen. Now let's discuss why this is happening within trucking companies. So why does the bullying come from this particular level of management? Well, for one thing, the carriers don't pay those positions particularly well. So you kind of get what you pay for. In this case, you've got guys that have never taken any HR training or personnel management training. You've just got regular guys that all of a sudden have too much power and too much control, and some of them suffer from that. And you get these dispatchers with God complexes and stuff. One day they're a janitor in the warehouse and the next day they're a dispatcher. I knew a carrier that specifically hired their new dispatchers from the janitorial staff. Think they had any background in how to handle people, how to handle the carrier's most valuable asset, the drivers? And the carriers don't want to pay so much, so they don't put people in charge that are particularly clever or well trained. Now let's discuss the different ways the trucking company bullies the driver. So how do they bully the drivers? All sorts of ways. They don't pay them for waiting time while they're sitting at shippers or receivers. They short their mileage on their pay. They'll say, oh, we're too busy, so you can't have those scheduled holidays right now. You're going to have to ride it out. They'll hand you unsafe delivery loads or hand bomb loads, or they'll bully you to run over your hours of service. Just anything to show a little bit of control, a little bit of flex. Or they'll force you into doing work that's unpaid by the carrier, even something as simple as washing your truck, something you should be paid for, but they won't pay you for it. Finally, we'll discuss how you as a driver can survive and thrive through this bullying culture. So how do you manage a situation like that? You've got to plant your feet and refuse to do anything that you see as bullying, like working for free, that type of thing. A good idea as well is to establish a working relationship with someone in upper management, someone with common sense who can overrule the dispatcher in a ridiculous situation, someone you can call once in a while and say, hey, you know, this guy is asking me to do this and not pay me for it, and I just don't think that's right. And hopefully this guy will run downstairs and overrule the dispatcher. And you don't want to have this happen too often, because this upper management guy is going to have jobs of his own that he's supposed to be doing. He can't be running defending you all the time. But every once in a while, a slap down from upper management is good to establish with your dispatcher that he's just not going to get away with very much stuff. Now you've got to recognize and know your terrain here too. You've got to understand how the carrier works. For instance, if the dispatcher is the boss's son, you're never going to win that deal. So you've got to be prepared to start to make preparations to jump ship, because that's a battle you're never going to win. And you've also got to figure out where you've got to draw your reasonable line in the sand. You can't be whining about every different thing, because bullying is part of the culture. This is part of the job that you signed up for. You've known that, or hopefully you've known that when you signed on. There are going to be people above you that are going to push you to do things you don't want to do. And you've got to be prepared to accept a little bit of that. It's the unreasonable stuff, like waiting 5 or 6 hours at a shipper's for no money, or something like that. It's the unreasonable stuff that's bullying, and that's what you've got to be prepared to have a workaround for. And that's why a relationship upstairs helps in a situation like that. Something else you've got to recognize in this industry too is that every once in a while a driver will get bullied by a customer. Now you've got to understand, in this situation, carriers do not like to upset customers. They don't want to lose customers. So if your complaint is about a customer, bear in mind the fact that you're probably going to lose this argument as well, but you can establish a workaround, like ask not to be sent to that particular loading dock or loading customer anymore. Tell them why. Tell them the guy treats you poorly and you just not put up with that. But don't expect the customer to change because the carrier gives them a call. The carrier is not going to call the customer in the first place, and the customer is not going to change. That's just the way it is. So be prepared to accept that too. Also, understand that there are times when you've just got to recognize that the nature of this carrier, the one that you're working for, that bullying is ingrained in the way they do business, and they're not going to change. And some carriers are like that. But bear in mind, there's lots of good carriers out there looking for experienced drivers. So you want to establish yourself as a reliable, experienced worker. And the upper management in the carrier will know your value and want to keep you. And if you're applying to a new carrier, you want to have that reputation going in as a solid, reliable driver. And that'll help you set your course for the future. Let me tell you a story in my history that I experienced in dealing with a situation like that. We at one time worked for a fairly good carrier, but they transferred in a new manager. In this case, it wasn't even a dispatcher, it was a new manager, and he decided he was going to clean house and clean things up. He didn't know anybody there, and he just decided he was going to draw his lines in the sand and make them hard and fast. So the culture was there that they would try to beat drivers down every dime and nickel. You know, and they're trying to save money, but they got into the shorting the mileage business. So I just happened to be in the office one day complaining on how they shorted my mileage, and I had proof that they did. And while I'm leaning over the counter, because you had to talk through a window at this place, one of the dispatchers who's on the phone hangs up the phone and says to everybody in the dispatch office, in an amazed voice, he goes, "Claire just quit." And everybody in that office knew that Claire was the senior driver of the company. He'd been there over 30 years. He knew everything there was to know about chemical hauling, which is what we did at this carrier. And he was the most valuable asset that company had. And everybody in the room knew that, except this new manager. And there was a pause in the action while these dispatchers explained to this manager who he just crossed with. And this guy was now prepared to quit because the new manager had drawn this line in the sand about shorting the miles that Claire just wasn't willing to put up with. And they basically told this new manager, the company will keep Claire before they keep you. So you better fix this situation, because if we lose Claire, you're gone. And all of a sudden, there was this big scramble, but it was a perfect illustration of how a valuable driver was recognized by the top echelon of this company, and they weren't prepared to lose him no matter what this guy said. It was a great opportunity to view the value of this guy, and I laughed about it ever since. I ended up leaving the carrier anyway. But Claire managed to hang on for another 1.5 years until he retired, and that was the end of that. At the end of the day, you've got to recognize that all carriers, to some extent, will try to bully their drivers. What you've got to do is figure out where your reasonable line in the sand is, draw it, and not be bullied and not cross that line. So stay safe, keep the rubber side down, don't allow yourself to be bullied, and I'll see you on the back haul.